readers, I'm Amy and I'm your nonfiction feminist. Today I will be reviewing The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. This was recommended by Lauren at Lauren in the Books. I will link her channel down below. And it is so hard to find words for my feelings about this book. I am so in love with it. It's definitely going to be a favorite for this year and probably one of my top favorites of all time. For this review, I will be talking about premise, plot, world building, and character. To get us started with the premise, the book is about the life of a gay man from basically birth to almost death, then a couple of months of his probable death. And he's adopted. He's been told his whole life that he's not a real Avery. That's kind of it for the premise. It's a life story about a guy who's trying to find his place in the world because he was adopted, and the way that adoption was approached was not the best, in my opinion. So this premise is super interesting to me, in large part because I myself am adopted. My parents were with my biological parents through most of the pregnancy. It was official after 72 hours after I came out of the womb, because that was kind of the mandatory at that time. You had a 72-hour waiting period. And I was told my whole life how loved I was and that I was part of the Gill family. And I think that was a really great approach to it. My parents said that they read me stories about my adoption, so one day I'm thinking about it and I'm like, when did I even learn that I was adopted? I've just kind of always known, and that's just it. I always knew because it was always a topic of conversation, something that I could ask my parents about, and I never felt unwanted by anyone. I know who my birth parents are. I have a pretty good relationship with them. I wouldn't say I'm particularly close to them, but they're still a part of my life. They're a part of my family, as well as my adoptive family, who is very much my family. They are very important to me. And I have never been told that I wasn't a Gill. Like, even now that I'm a Myers, I'm still a Gill at heart, because that's where I came from. Those are the people who raised me, who gave parts of themselves to make my life better. So that's kind of my personal connection with this book. So seeing how this book approaches adoption was an adventure. As for the plot of The Heart's Invisible Furies, there's a lot that goes on here. I'm not going to cover all of it. The book starts with Cyril Avery's mother. She's in a very small kind of village in Ireland. They just learned that she was pregnant the day before, and this day she's in the church getting told off by the priest that she has to leave the town. She's a sinner. She needs to name the man who got her pregnant so that he can be forgiven, but she has to be kicked out of the town, which, yeah, that seems totally fair, but whatever. So we go with her on her journey to Dublin, and on the train there she makes friends with a guy who is waiting for a job and a roommate in Dublin. She finds a way for them to kind of let her room with them. The guy they end up staying with is not happy that she's there. We quickly find out why, and even though he's not happy with it, he puts up with it. Stuff happens. She eventually gets a job in Dublin, makes a little money to help pay for rent, has her baby, gives him up for adoption so that she can continue to work, because, and this is very much where I think my story is coming from, where she simply can't afford a child at this point. She just moved to Dublin. She has no money because the little bit that she does goes to rent and food and taking care of herself every day. She knows adoption is what's best for her child. So she gets him adopted. And the family that adopts him, it's Maud and Charles Avery. And they had a kid before. She died when she was a baby. They apparently wanted another kid, but they don't really treat Cyril like they wanted another kid. I would not say he's abused, but the way they talk about him, like, it's mean, for sure, but in a really funny way. Like, they treat him like a tiny adult. They have sex talks with him pretty regularly, not necessarily for his learning experience, but just for someone to talk to. And they're always saying, "You're not a real Avery. We're your adopted parents." And he calls them by their first names, and they're interesting. Charles is a banker. He's involved in fraud. He is in and out of jail throughout this entire book. Maud is an author. She does not really see herself as an author. She hates fame. She detests fame, really. She thinks her books are awful. But at one point, because of Charles's fraud and his name getting all these papers and stuff, she becomes famous. A lot of the plot is people talking to Cyril about his adoptive mother, who they just call his mother, and he always corrects them saying that she's his adoptive mother. And at the point that she really becomes famous, she has died, but her literature is some of the best. It's like some key literature to read if you want to know anything about Ireland. And she would have hated it, and they talk throughout the book about how she would have hated it, but the main thing that you keep noticing is throughout his whole life, he's still doing what he always did as a child, where he corrects people saying, "My adoptive mother, not my real mother." So a lot of this plot is kind of, what is a family to you? What makes a real family? And that was really well done. You also meet Julian whenever Cyril is about 7 years old. They're the same age. He kind of falls in love with him on sight, sort of a thing. And again, another huge plot line is his love for Julian and how that affects him throughout his life. So a lot of the plot from there on is him kind of coming into his own in this world. Like, he gets a job, he's exploring himself as a gay man, he's trying to make friends and try and find a place for himself in the world. Bunch of stuff happens. I don't really remember all of it, but I know that it was good. And then we get to the 1980s. I know I'm skipping a lot here. We get to the 1980s and you have the AIDS epidemic. That is a powerful part. What I really loved about this is that at the time of the AIDS epidemic, he is volunteering in a hospital on the floor where all of the AIDS patients are. And a lot of the patients that the book talks about are heterosexual. And it talks about how much they blame homosexual people for bringing in the AIDS virus, saying, "This is your disease, not my disease. I shouldn't be dying of this." And you have people saying, "Did you hear this person died of AIDS? He was totally gay." And it's like, no, not necessarily. He just got AIDS. AIDS and homosexuality are two distinct, different things here. You need to separate those two. So the exploration of gay stereotypes in this book was just awesome. It showed through really well in the characters and their interactions with each other and their responses to these stereotypes. It was really well done. There is a little bit about 9/11 in this story, as Cyril had lived in New York for a time. I think he's in Ireland by the time 9/11 happens. And because of things that happened to him while he was living in New York, he's experiencing some kind of PTSD related episodes while watching the news about 9/11. Eventually, we kind of go on to the end of his story, how that happens. That's basically the plot. I know I skipped a lot there. Those are kind of the highlights. For our next section, we have world building. The world building was awesome. I didn't think you would really need much world building for a time that we're basically kind of currently living in. We're influenced very heavily right now by still like the late 1900s, the early 2000s. That's a very recent time for us. You wouldn't think there would really need to be a lot of world building there, but there was, and it was awesome. A large part of this world was built through character interaction and character development. You have people's attitudes about gayness, attitudes about AIDS, kind of politics of the time in Ireland and the rest of the world, and all these interactions between the characters and all these events that happen around the characters and to the characters builds the world and really gives you a sense of what this time was like for this person. And it's not just the general building of the world, it's also the building of these individual worlds. You very much get a sense of what each character's individual world is like. Maud's world is her office, where she has all of these ideas that she decides to write down. She gets them published just to do something with them, and she just tosses it away. Her books aren't really part of her world. She doesn't really want anything to do with them after they're written. And it goes into a little bit about how that changes as she becomes more and more well known. You have Cyril's world, where he's gay. He's not able to do a lot with that, at least not publicly, because gays are very, very discriminated against in Ireland at this time. That's kind of the world that he's dealing with, where he's got all of these emotions and these feelings that he can't do anything with. They lead to him making some pretty terrible decisions. I'm back and forth on Cyril on whether I even like him as a character, but really he is essentially human, and the things that he does that I think are really terrible, what would I do in that situation though? Because he, as a gay man at this time in this country, doesn't really have a ton of options. I think he could have pretty easily been a slightly better person, but that's just me living in the time that I live in now. So I'm not really one to speak. We also see Julian's world as an extremely heterosexual man, and how his interactions end up influencing his life and building his world. There's the little worlds and there's the big world, and it's all very, very well done. And then lastly, we have characters and character development. Again, it's another very strong suit of this book. You get a total sense of each character. There are so many characters in this book. The minor ones you don't really learn as much about, but you do see how they fit into the characters' lives. The major ones, like Charles and Maud, who are Cyril's adoptive parents, Cyril himself, Julian's sister. Even if you only meet them for short bits every couple of chapters, you know who that character is. You know what their reactions are like, what their interactions with others are like. You understand so much about them, and it just... it was so well done. Ultimately, I feel like this wasn't the most informative review. It's just me ranting about how in love I am with The Heart's Invisible Furies. This author was also the same guy that came up with The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I have not read the book. I watched the movie. It tore me to pieces. Now I really, really can't wait to read the book. Hopefully I will get to that later this year. But that's pretty much it. The writing for this book was amazing. The characters, the world, the plot, it was so well thought out. It is a longer book on audio. It was about 20 hours. It has really, really high ratings on Goodreads. It's, I think, 4.47 last I checked. So I think there's a pretty good chance you'll like it if it's something that you think you're interested in reading. So that's what I have for you. As usual, like, subscribe, be my friend. I have Instagram, Goodreads, and Twitter links down below. I will see you next time.